So it's finally time to do the third tier list for units in Maddening mode. Now this is not for DLC. I'm not including the DLC characters yet. I haven't played around with them enough, and most of my experience is in base game, so this is just for base game Maddening. In DLC Maddening, I think a lot of things move up, basically. I don't think things get worse in DLC, so like if you want to kind of extract a DLC play or DLC tiering out of this, just kind of add a tier or two potentially to some lower units. All right, so this is for base game Maddening. The way I'm going to be evaluating units is based on how well they can do with investment, what's required to get them up and running. Some units have more upfront costs to running them. Other units, you just run them and they're immediately good. How well do these fit into a team? How well can they be turned into hard carries? Some units have massive potential to be made into like demigods, essentially, even in base game without DLC. So I'm factoring that in. So if something's an S tier, it has to have unique qualities or really good bases or really good stats or a combination of a bunch of different things, maybe really good passive, good availability. So I'm going to be factoring in a lot of things. But essentially, if something fills a role and it does it really well, it will place high. And if something fills a role and it does okay at it, it'll place medium. And if something fills a role and it does bad, it'll place low. So that's like the overall gist of how I'm going to be rating things. All right, so Hortensia. So this list is kind of out of order. And that's fine because then it adds more. Like I don't like to go through the entire game like from start to finish. I'd rather just be random. Okay, so Hortensia. So Hortensia is most people's dedicated staff bot, or at least a staff bot. When you get her, you don't really need to do anything to her. You can just advance her into her next class, throw a bunch of staves on her and call it a day. She can also sometimes contribute to damage situationally, but she's one of the best Micaiah users, specifically because she can position well and also extend the range of warps, as well as conserve uses of things like warp and entrap and, you know, rare, expensive staves that are hard to get. Now that the well is in the game, I'm iffy on her passive. Before the well, I would say she's potentially S tier, maybe high A tier, just because of the fact that she can conserve staff uses. But after the well, if you tier 4 well constantly, the game will hand you warp and rescue staves. So you don't really need to worry about the uses anymore because you can get a ton of free staves just from welling. So I'm going to put her in A tier. She doesn't necessarily do staff botting that much better than other units, to be honest. Like anyone can become a staff bot, and if you want another staff bot that can fly, Griffin Knight exists. So she doesn't have a niche that's unique to her. However, unlike her, a Griffin Knight has good combat prowess, can fight things, has a better passive for situationally increasing movement, like in terms of utility. So like if you have ground units who are having a hard time getting over some like tile, even whether it be fire, water, whatever, trees, Griffin Knight can clear the way, which allows your units to use the Griffin Knight as a kind of plus-shaped bridge to remove like movement reduction effects. So I think she's just A tier. You don't have to do anything to her, though. Like, you can just run her and she's just decent. The only problem I have with her is if you're not using her for, like, warp skipping and you actually want to use her for combat, she's not the best combat unit. Otherwise, I'd put her in S. For utility, I don't think she's that much better than other utilities. Her only thing is she has slightly increased range, which is useful, but it's not like that in of itself is going to enable warp skipping, whereas without it, it won't. So it's nice to have, but it's not going to... Like, you can still warp skip all the maps you want to warp skip, right? So if her range +1 does anything that's useful, it's like the extra healing range on like mend or treat or recover, like things like this. That's kind of nice because Physic has a kind of long range but weak heal. So I would say A tier is fair for her. For Vander's my voice cracked. Vander's very weird, right? Like some people like him because he makes the early game easy, which is true. But if you have the early game solved, he's literally useless, and you can literally let him die early and it doesn't matter, and you can easily beat the early game chapters without him. You can funnel all of the XP into units in the early game. You can still use him to set up kills, though. I still want to say he's D tier, though, because like the early game is not the hard part of the game on Maddening mode. So he helps you when you need help the least. So I don't value that at all. In mid game, like he has such a high internal level. He has bad growths. He has bad bases. As you enter the mid game, he falls off of a cliff. So like he's only really relevant for the first like 5 to 6 chapters, and then enemies start getting better and better stats, and he just stays behind. So for whatever reason, the developers made it so that his internal level kind of caps him out. And if you want to continue using him, you can, but you'll find that your other units are going to start doubling where he can't. They're going to tank better than him, even on classes that can't tank. And he is on Paladin, which should be reasonably tanky, but in his case, it's just not. So he just falls off, and he helps you on the chapters that you frankly don't need help with unless you're brand new and you're playing the game blind. Clan, I don't really care for at all. I feel like, all right, I'm going to put Clan in C. Some people found success by switching him to physical. He's kind of like Anna, but the return on investment isn't really there. So like the idea behind investing in Anna is you get a decent combat unit that in some cases can kind of be a hard carry with the right level of investment and resource allocation, but she can uniquely generate money. Now, she's basically worse than Pantrea, statistically, but he doesn't have that return on investment she does, and she actually is useful once you, like, if you just get her levels up, or if you hand her Makayo, however you want to do it, there's all these different ways. It's a tired argument. Some people think she's, like, Anna's low tier, some people think she's high. Clan is kind of like an Anna that has no payoff, and the best thing he can be with overinvestment is worse than other units at like physical combat. So I just don't think he's worth it at all. And as a mage, he has terrible like magic growth rate. So he's like, these two need their bases switched. He needs to be a backup, and she needs to be on mage. And these would both be like A, potentially S tier. But because he's on the wrong class, and he's just kind of like a starter mage, he usually should get benched. All right, Fram. I think there's actually an argument that Fram is S tier. Now this is going to seem strange, especially because she's a utility, but she uniquely has good supports with some of the best units in the game. So for reference, let's pull some stuff up really quick. All right, hold on. It's the wrong thing. That's not what we want. Here we go. Okay, so here are Fram's supports. So everyone has a support with Alear. That's great. She has Chloe. She has Kagetsu. She has Goldmary. She has Timerra. She has Anna. So of those units, Chloe is arguably in the metagame. Kagetsu is arguably in the metagame. Chloe, it depends on the type of run you're doing. If you're doing like LTC, I could see Chloe not being in the metagame because she can't get enough kills to power level, because that's just what naturally happens because of her high speed if you just hand her a good weapon, which is unique to her early game because she's very fast. Speed doubles, and very few things have high speed early, so she just naturally doubles and secures kills for herself, which power levels herself. She can also enemy phase fairly well. Goldmary, I think a lot of people agree she's good. Getsu, a lot of people agree he's S tier. Timerra, some people put her low. I say she's like A tier. I think she's a solid tank with the right setup. I don't think it takes much to get her going, kind of similar to Goldmary. But the reason you want supports is for dual support for Bonded Shield. But that's not the only reason why I think Fram is good. I think Fram is good is because of Chain Guard, free utility, free avoid to Alear. So if she's standing next to Alear, they both get avoid plus 10, and then they also get more avoid based on the support level. So she can enable Alear dodge tanking while also enabling Chain Guard. She can enable other units dodge tanking while also enabling Chain Guard or Bonded Shield. And on Maddening mode, being able to pull an enemy, Chain Guard its attack, and then counterattack and kill it is massive. And it just helps at all stages of the game. She also has staff use. So she's basically, I think she's better than Hortensia because she can take a hit and she can easily be made into a dodge tank, and she has Chain Guard. So she can Bonded Shield or Chain Guard and enable hyper-aggressive play or absurd tanking, which, you know, other units can use Bonded Shield, but she has good supports with hard carries and also uniquely boosts Alear's avoid as well as her own. So she generally will not be targeted. She can easily hit high enough avoid rates when bonding with a Bonded Shield that she and just one other unit can hold an entire front, and the enemies will ignore her because her avoid is too high. So you can easily build her so that she has like a super avoid Lucina bonded shield, and she can be next to just a single ally and have high enough avoid to enable 2 units to tank any number of enemies, provided they don't have like some specific thing like backup spam or whatever. But you can mitigate that with positioning. So I legitimately think for free, she levels herself up from chain running and healing, and she just does that throughout the entire run. You can hyper focus in on the best units as you're going throughout your run to make god tier units that are completely broken with crazy abilities. You can focus all your engravings, your XP, your SP on your main units, and there's very few downsides to running her. She's free utility, and she's not trying to kill things either. Like, she's just a utility. That's how she's S tier. I think she's better than Hortensia because of availability, because of team composition. I think that Hortensia's flyer weakness can be mildly annoying. Her low max HP can be annoying. Hortensia is kind of like an easier target. Fram has more defensive stats, so if she actually gets attacked, like her avoid tanking's so good that she's fine, she won't get hit. But if she actually gets attacked, she has enough speed, health, she has enough bulk to tank a hit usually. Whereas Hortensia specifically has very low bulk and also has this like flyer weakness, so you have to be a little bit extra careful with her. So not only will flyer weakness kill her, but most other things will. So I think she's a better support, honestly. They're both staff users. This is more of a bonded shield. This is more of a Micaiah. And if you're not running warp skip, you know, I don't think she's very useful, to be honest. If you're not running a warp skip team, I don't think Hortensia is worth running. I think she exists specifically for that. Outside of that, she's still a solid unit and a solid utility, but I think Fram is actually very strong. Etier. Now, this is base game, and DLC, I think Etier is probably actually good with Starsphere, but pretty much anyone's good with Starsphere. With Starsphere, she actually has a lot of potential, so all the Etier fans rejoice. I would put her in like B tier on DLC. For main game, I would say high C or low B tier. Like, I see the use case. Like, I understand that she has decent strength growth, that she can, you know, one-shot flyers. I don't value one-shotting flyers because the builds I make can just one-round flyers regardless of weapon type, so that doesn't mean anything to me. But for people who run archers, I'm going to put her in high C tier. All right, so right now it looks like she's in the same thing as him, but he's low. She's like high C tier. Like, she at least is useful. She can shoot down things early on. I think that's overhyped, though, because the early game flyers are very weak. They deal terrible damage even if they double, so like anyone can tank them and it's fine. But I think, you know, maybe low B tier if I'm being generous, high C tier. She's like a high investment unit with like minimal payoff, I would argue. All right, Chloe. I think Chloe is insane at this point in time. If you run the hero weapons, which I think are default in the base game now, plus you can easily get her like lance power 2 to 3 before you lose Sigurd. And even without that, like once you get her on Wyvern, she completely can solo early game and mid game chapters. It's super stupid. Like, she's so strong. And then with lance power, once you get Sigurd back, her end game is no longer an issue. Some people had her damage falling off in end game, but if you put her on Wyvern, you get her like speed plus 3 to 5 and lance power, and she can double pretty much anything, including fast enemies in some cases, and reliably one round most things, hit like a truck. She can, and then with DLC, she's like god tier, like straight up, because she's one of the units I used in my 5-man run. But in the base game, I'd say she's a very strong hard carry that can completely destroy the early to mid game, and that also is very relevant in the late game. Louis, he seems decent. I wouldn't put him higher than B. He's serviceable. He's a tank. You can invest in him if you want. I don't think the return on him is as good as Chloe because she can enemy phase in one round things. He can't do that early on. She can enemy phase with a javelin and kill a ton of stuff, including archers if you use a bunch of chain guards. He can't double, and his accuracy is so-so. So he misses sometimes when he's counterattacking, and I don't like that. If I'm counterattacking an enemy phase, I want to hit, I want to kill. So he can't enemy phase very well against physical, and against magical, you can use things like chain guard, you can use things like pure water. He does have really good like defensive and strength growth, so he can hit like a truck if you build him out correctly. If you want to run smash weapons on him, you can do that as well. That's probably the best use case for him on like general or something like that. He's pretty much never going to double anything, and he's always going to get doubled by things. So that's always a problem for him unless he becomes, like overfed, but any unit that's overfed will generally perform well. But for that reason, I mean, just for the tanking, the enemy phasing, I'd say he's a solid B tier. For Boucheron, I actually think he's not bad. I think he's like, if you just hand him like a compact axe or like an iron axe or engrave like a steel axe with accuracy, he's actually pretty good early game. And he's weird in that he has like low strength growth but like high build and high speed growth. But axes luckily hit really hard, so he's one of the few units who can potentially, double consistently on Warrior, for example, because of his speed growth. And Warrior would kind of fix his strength growth, so he would have like 50s in strength and speed growth, roughly speaking. So, and of course the high build growth plus the build from Warrior, so you're looking at pretty decent build growth. So he's potentially A tier with investment, but from what I've seen of him, the best I've been able to get him is like a solid B tier, like low B, high C tier type unit. All right, Anna, my opinion on Anna has changed a little bit. I would put her in A, just because it's not free, like how much is required of you to get her online. Originally, like before the well and before the hero's weapons, I would say she's S tier for the economy and A tier as a unit, because on my second run, she made me like 70k. So that's like a lot of money. Just from doing all these paralogs, she would making like 2 to 3k a mission consistently, sometimes like 4 to 5 on some missions. I just went hardcore into the luck. I got her luck plus 12, and then Byleth gave her plus 12 luck, and she had like 40 something luck. So she's just constantly triggering, and it triggers on void curse enemies too. So on paralogs where there's just tons of spam enemies, you just bonded shield and she'll just kill tons of things and just make like thousands of gold. So like before the well and the hero's weapons, I would say her economy impact was very relevant. I would say after the well, because you can profit from the well, and even without it, you don't really need to, because SP is worth more than gold because it makes the game easier. So like the main reason you even need gold is to upgrade weapons and to buy materials or to donate. And you don't really buy weapons in this game. The game just hands you weapons and you can just reforge them. There's like a few, throughout an entire Maddening run, I'll buy maybe 2 weapons, 3 weapons from the store at most. And like the most of what I buy are like staves, right? So gold is really useful for donating to get crafting materials, for upgrading and for upgrading. That's really what gold is used for. So when you don't need to upgrade as much because you have crazy passives and you're not leaning on upgrading as much, Anna is less relevant. So like when I originally thought that Anna was going to be less impactful because of the well, it was because of the influence of more SP into the game's ecosystem. So instead of having, a need for money for weapon upgrades, you can just get lance power. Like what's better, spending, I don't know, 30k worth of gold and combined iron, steel, and silver plus gold converted into gold, like 30k worth of resources, or just welling a bunch of times, taking like a 1 to 2k loss per well and then getting lance power 5 on a unit, effectively giving it plus 10 damage per hit. It's obvious which one's better, right? It's significantly cheaper to well and the results are better. Like getting Lunar Brace on a unit getting Lunar Brace, Reprisal, Wrath, Vantage ++, like all this stuff, like that's way better than weapon upgrades because it's mechanics. Like you're getting new mechanics, you're getting true damage, you're getting crazy advantage from welling. Welling is way better than engraving. You should still do both, but you should prioritize getting tier 4 wells, and you will not regret it. Unless somehow you're bad with money or you donate wrong. Generally, you should donate like this. Fyrne 2, Brodia 4, Psalm 2, Illusia 2. And then if you want to get any of them to 3 or 4, go for it, but you should be welling, tier 4 welling the entire time. Okay, Amber. I'd say Amber's low B tier. He has decent bases, decent stats, or decent growth rates. He's not the worst unit in terms of combat. His passive is okay. It's like something decent. It's like a hit rate passive. I feel like by the time you get him, there's just better things, and he's just outshined by things like Chloe and even Diamant. So he's okay, though. He's not bad. And if you invest in him, he does have decent strength growth, so there's some potential for snowballing on like a Halberdier or something. So he could become like a relevant endgame unit. Alear, I think, honestly, Alear... So Alear is like the favoritism unit, I think. A lot of people like to put Alear in S, Maybe Alear is as good. All right, I'll say this. Alear is Alear is as good as Chloe if not always, but if you early snowball Alear. And then Alear catches up to Chloe and then starts doubling and one rounding similar to Chloe with the right weapon. So I would say that's when Alear is S tier. So it's like S tier with an asterisk. Chloe to some degree is S tier with an asterisk, but it's kind of effortless to level her up. She doubles pretty consistently against most targets, and then once her speed gets going, it just keeps going. But Alear without investment can be quite weak, but Alear with investment, which I do think is optimal, unless you're trying to do LTC or something specific like that, your Alear should be pretty strong. So I would say Alear is S tier with early investment, and then afterwards just snowballs. Jade, I would say is like same tier as Louis. They're both kind of just decent. They're, tanks, physical tanks that are slow. She has poor speed growth, I think okay strength growth, kind of like average growth otherwise, like nothing standout. But outside of growth, she's just like a solid, like okay tank. I did use her in my first Maddening run, and she actually was a pretty good tank on Tomahawk, and she enemy phased fairly well, actually. The only thing that caused her to die was me playing Chapter 17 poorly and just deciding to just let her die instead of starting the map, because, she barely, like, I didn't have the tactics down as a blind run, so whatever. But she was actually pretty solid on general, but I think I might have overfed her, so it's kind of debatable. But she felt like a B tier during that. Lapis, honestly, she's definitely not S tier. I would say she's like low A tier. I think that's fair. On Wyvern, she's pretty solid. She does need like a hit increase as you enter mid to late game. Otherwise, her accuracy is usually good enough. But weirdly, she has slightly worse or much worse dex than Chloe. But if you give her an engraving that just scales accuracy even just by like 10 or 20, that's usually enough to fix her accuracy. And that keeps her relevant to some degree. She's like low A tier. You do have to second seal her onto Wyvern. So you have to master seal her into Swordmaster, second seal her into Wyvern. But she's actually pretty solid. And it felt like I had 2 Chloes in the early game, which was kind of hilarious in one of my runs. And it didn't take much to get her there because she's already level 10. So pretty low investment. All right, Citrine. I'll give her high B tier. So with Dire Thunder, I would say she's A tier. Only A tier because she still gets doubled by everything that attacks her, so she'll die, which is a point against her, because if you wanted to enemy phase even just for a single turn, it's probably not happening. She's basically like a player phase unit that wants some favoritism in item creation. She wants the Dire Thunder ring, so that's like her main thing. Her speed is pretty bad, and it's hard to get her to doubling thresholds. You need like speed +5 and speed taker, and also maybe an emblem ring that boosts her speed if you want her to double. I'm also pretty sure her build is bad, like her build stat. So she's pretty slow. She has pretty low build, which is true of most mages, but some of them are fast enough to offset that. And she does kind of feel like outside of Dire Thunder, she has nothing going on. And Dire Thunder isn't unique to her either, so I think B is fair. Merrin, I think, is pretty good. Let me pull up growths. I actually have them over here. I actually have like the growth tab open all the time, like even when I'm playing the game for some reason. All right, so Merrin. I just like to remind myself like what the growths are every now and then. All right, so she's 50 speed. I remembered she had 50 speed and then 25 strength. Okay, that's what I thought. She is a solid unit. I think she's a pretty good, like, overall, like, speedy unit that wants to be on something like Wyvern or maybe even Warrior. And she's quite good. I do think she's better than Lapis. I want to say she's A tier. I don't think she's S tier because her bases are just decent. And you can snowball her, but by the time you get her, you have all these, like, really solid units that are competing for XP. Because that's essentially what happens. One thing I noticed really early on, like during my first Maddening run, was that I had like an A team and a B team. And I always remember getting frustrated in my first Maddening run with like how my A team units would just demolish whatever I had them attack. And then my B team units would just like struggle to hit, and they wouldn't double and they wouldn't deal good damage. And I quickly realized that you just have to run more utilities and just fewer combat units, and that's why like Fram is up here, because she's like a very solid utility. But she's just kind of like an above average, good, speedy damage dealer. And by the time you get her, these two probably already have engraved weapons, and she will not. And I know that's a resource that can be given to anyone, but there are certain engravings you get early game that are going to be put on certain weapons that won't be put on other weapons. So I can't just re-engrave Marth onto her weapon, for example, unless I hand her a weapon that she's like, you know, second sealed into a class that can run that weapon. So like that's, you know, it's probably not reasonable to assume you're going to try to put Sigurd or Marth engraving on Merrin's weapon, because by the time you get her, they're already on somebody else's weapon, very likely, right? So you can't just re-engrave it. You'd have to plan ahead of time. Maybe it's on a lance and she becomes a lance wyvern, whatever. But that being said, Chloe usually does have better stats than her by the time you get her if she's on wyvern the entire time, because she snowballs. So by the time you get her, she's already better. Same thing with Alear, because they uniquely should be getting kills. You can basically like beat a lot of the early chapters with like 5 units easily, base game. It's not hard to do. I literally just did for my 7-man run, which is no DLC run. That I'm on like chapter 18 on that. All right, Panette. I'm gonna give a rest here. She's up there. She has enemy phase builds that are completely insane. She has player phase builds that are completely insane. She can do a lot. She brings a lot to the table. She requires almost nothing to get her going, and she has a lot going for her that other units don't have. She has very high base strength, and she can straight up one-round things with like Tomahawk and shit. Like, she has a lot going on. She has some interesting builds as well. She has like the Vantage crit build where you run Roy, so you have like holdout from Roy so that you can survive lethal damage, and you run crit. You can run Vantage, and then you also have Wrath. So her Wrath Vantage build is really good. She also has a Leaf build where you keep Leaf at 4 bond level, and you run a Killer Axe and a Killer Bow. I'm so glad someone posted this comment because it's so sick. I haven't run it, but I get how it works, and it's pretty sick. So you run Leaf, who gives you Vantage. You keep her at low health, so you have Vantage from Leaf. You have Wrath, and then when something attacks you and you're at bond level 4 on Leaf, she will adaptable between the Killer Axe and the Killer Bow. And you crit engrave both of them, and she can enemy phase one-shot anything. And then you can also throw holdout on her for like a get out of jail free card in case something hits her. So that way she can survive like 1 or 2 lethal blows. Like, you know, sometimes she'll be at like 40 health, she'll get hit for like 20 or something. So potentially could survive 1 to 2 combats, even through the Vantage. But pretty solid, a lot of interesting builds, a lot of good... Even just for player phase nuking, she can effortlessly one-round things with a lot of different builds. So that's pretty nice. Even just that, I would say, is a justification for some S tier. Pandreo, he's definitely up here too, to be honest. He's probably the best mage in the game. I personally don't run him a lot, but I totally get it. Like, I see the bases, I see the growth rates. He has really high build, which is unique to him. Because one of Anna's problems is she has low build, so that kind of hurts her long term. She needs like build fixing or speed fix. She needs more speed fixing than he does. He also has a really good passive that just allows him to be more avoidant in general. So even if you just want to flip him into a utility and not even use him as a damage unit, like let's say you wanted to make him like a Chi Adept or something, or like a bonded shield user, he could still benefit from all the increased avoid that his build or his passive gives him. It also increases his hit rate, which is nice. So he never has hit issues for the most part. But very solid unit overall. Pretty much no downside. He even has good bulk too, so he can tank a little bit. Bune, I would say he's like here. He's very similar to these in terms of stats. Someone keeps religiously pointing this out. They did in the past like couple of weeks. That like if you think these are basically similar in terms of stats, then you know you get these around the same time. So they're just a bruiser, low speed. You can use him if you want to. He's not gonna make or break your playthrough, but you can use him for off tanking or whatever. Dancer. I honestly think Dancer is like here. Dancer is S tier, but I think it's like mid S tier because of how strong enemy phasing can get in this game. Now, if you're only doing player phasing, if you're doing LTC, or if you're like not really relying on enemy phase tactics, you can still beat the game pretty easily on Maddening by doing this. But I'm assuming both play styles when placing him, so I'm assuming that you can be doing more than, just... What is it? So instead of just doing like LTC or warp strats or whatever, I'm also assuming you would be doing some enemy phasing, some tanking. So like when you have enemy phase heavy builds, he's still very relevant and very useful. And he can also chain guard. So he can still be a support, like a Chi Adept. But between the two of these, very often I found that just like a Lucina Bonded Shield can clear up more enemies than Dancing can, but Dancing can also kill bosses, so I do still think he's better than Fram as utility. So like these are like damage units, and these are utility units, and I don't think he's better than these, because without these, he doesn't do anything. And same thing with her. So like utility units, they can never be better than the things they're supporting, in my opinion, because they just enable these things. At least that's the way I view it. But Dancing's really solid, the easy S tier. The Curious Dance or whatever is free AoE healing. You throw in Quality Time and Cancer, and he's just constantly AoE healing, repositioning, and he's really good. Very good for attacking, very good for defending with Chain Guard. If you have both of these, I would say that's ideal, because then you have 2 Chain Guarders, you have a hardcore utility, you have a staff unit. They can Chain Guard each other, which is hilarious. So if there's 2 enemies that can attack, they can Chain Guard each other and, tank better. They're both pretty fast. He has decent bulk. He can usually take a hit. His defensive stats can be low, but he's fast. So as long as the might isn't too high, he can tank a hit. But the utility's there, the dancing is there. It's very useful. Zelkov, I'm going to put him in A tier. He's like here. You basically have to do nothing to get him up and running. His bases are good, but his growths are average, to be honest, and he has bad res, so he can easily get nuked down by enemy mystical, even on avoid tiles, because they ignore avoid tiles, and because he has bad res, he can get killed by them pretty easily. So that's something you have to kind of play around. You can pump him full of like pure water or talismans or some kind of other thing. Maybe have a chain guarder hanging out with him in the fog as a precaution, because everyone else will miss, and when something finally does connect, the chain guard will then absorb the hit and prevent him from getting hit hard by magic. So you can play around the fog. Personally, I don't do fog strats. I would rather just use Bonded Shield, because it's just more straightforward, and then I can have someone else use Corrin, and then I can freeze as needed instead of just constantly spamming fog every turn. But it is legit, and it can probably solo the game, so there's that. I mean, depending on the build, but yeah. Kagetsu, I would say he's here. I have him below these because I feel like these can snowball, and I also feel like he has like an awkward period before he becomes like truly good. So what do I mean by that? So depending on what class you want to run him on, he takes a little bit more effort to get online because of the availability of proficiencies. So if you want to make him like a Wyvern right away, you have to wait until the end of chapter 13. So you have to like play this out, right? Like you get him chapter 11 at the end. So you have him for chapter 12 and chapter 13. Chapter 12, he is a 5-move ground unit who has low strength and has access to swords. So he's not that good on chapter 12, if we're being honest. He's like painfully average on chapter 12. And then on chapter 13, I would argue he's not that good as well, because by this point in time, I could have like 2 super wyverns who outperform him, and he can't even become a wyvern until after that. And then when you do finally get him to become a wyvern, if you want to run him as one, you can run him as like paladin and other stuff. But if you finally get him on wyvern in chapter 14, that's when he starts popping off, in my opinion. He can pop off on other classes too, maybe if you switch him to other things, but you can't get him onto wyvern until chapter 14. And by that point, I already have 2 good wyverns. And also, I mean, I guess he would be better than Merrin on wyvern. I usually just run her, but I could just run him. It's kind of like the same thing. So he does seem to be better than her in general. So if I go to his like base stats, so let's see, characters. Base stats do matter. Depends on how much of a difference there is. Characters' base stats. All right, so Merrin's base stats, and they have to factor in their class. So changing classes does change these. Her base stats, so she's at 15 strength, but Wolf Knight has lower strength, and then 21 speed. Wolf Knight has higher speed. And then for him, he has 17 strength on Swordmaster, which is also a low strength class, and then 22 speed, so it's also a fast class. I believe he has similar build, strength, and speed than her. Maybe it's like slightly higher. So potentially he's the better unit in general, but like overall, I would say he is stronger. His passive's good, but her passive's good too. Like, her passive's not bad. +5 hit and avoid to all your females if there's 2 or more females. It's pretty crazy. Especially if you stack in, like, dual support stuff. Especially if you run dual support. I haven't tried that, but I think it'd be really dumb. Like, really overpowered, so... Alright, Rosado. Rosado is interesting because I feel like he's actually better than most people think. His bases... 21 speed, 16 strength on Wyvern. 21 speed on Chapter 16 is kind of rough, and he has 8 build. Maybe I'll put him in B tier. I think that's fair, like high B tier. I think he has some potential to be decent, but he's definitely not fast enough. Because you have to consider you get him on Chapter 16, so before you can even do anything to him, it's Chapter 17. So you're like entering the end game, and he has 16 strength and 21 speed, and you have to like completely kit him out, you know, get him weapons, engravings, all this stuff. I feel like there's just not enough good engravings and weapons on the non-DLC version of the game. Like, if you don't run the heroes weapons, I feel like you really have to push to make certain things viable. Like, you have to upgrade steel and silver weapons or run a bunch of like unique utility weapons. And I feel like by the point in time you get him, you have all these other units kitted out. Even if it's just these, or even just like these, like everyone's competing for resources on your team, so you want to put them where it makes the most sense. But I would say he's like here. Goldmary, I think she's like mid A tier, like here. She's pretty solid as a tank. She has good defensive stat, good defensive growth. She doesn't have good speed growth. It's 40% on hero, which isn't bad, but she has decent base speed, and with speed fixing, she can double most things and avoid getting doubled by most things. So she can enemy phase fairly well and has okay strength. She can also do the Brave Assist thing. She's actually a good tank on hero, and there's different emblem rings you can run on her to complement this. You can also throw her on general if you want to have even more tanking, but this will cause her to get doubled, and then mages become a problem, so she can get nuked down by mages on general. So, but there's other classes aside from hero that she's good on. But if you just leave her on hero and just invest in her a little bit, she'll be decent. Yunaka, I don't know. A lot of people say different things about her. Some people put her at S, some people are at A. Like, people usually place her in this range. Personally, I think she's like here, maybe here. I think she's like similar to Zelkov. She has better res than Zelkov. He does have better build, but the build doesn't really matter on Thieves. Silver Dagger loses weight at +3 and +5, which makes it weightless for her. And I do think she has a little bit of build growth. So let me confirm that. I think she has like 5 or 10. Yunaka, she's 5% build growth. So if she levels up 20 times, she'll get a point of build, which really isn't that good. But you could speed fix her weapon, or I'm sorry, weight fix it, meaning put an engraving that reduces weight by 1. But she does have much better res, and she has the crit passive, so there's some potential there for like a crit steel dagger build with an engraving, or even just like a general damage silver dagger build. On steel dagger, it weighs nothing for her. On silver dagger, it weighs nothing for him because he has higher build. But she tanks, like, there's trade-offs. I don't think one is better than the other. I think they both have pros and cons that require some evaluation, but they're pretty similar in terms of performance, I would say. Jean, I'm going to put him at low A tier. So if you overinvest in him, I don't even think he becomes like a god tier unit or really cracked or really insane. I think he just becomes like a low A tier unit. But if you just use him as another utility, I think this is where he shines. And this was a mistake that I made when evaluating him on my one run, where I'm like, oh man, John's going to be amazing because of expertise and blah, 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 blah. And I just had him, you know, be a chain guarding staff bot. But honestly, as a chain guarding staff bot, it's free XP. It's free utility. It doesn't take away engravings or weapons or resources from your hard carry damage units or tanks. And it's, you know, staff bot chain guard utility guy. Throws obstruct down, restores when needed, whatever. Whatever staff you need, he can run. He can complement Fram. Like, you can have multiple chain guarders. It helps you do multiple pulls. So a pull is when you have an enemy attack you on purpose in a way that's favorable to you. So you chain guard a damage unit that can double on counterattack, take 0 damage, the chain guarder takes some chip damage, you kill the thing that you pulled, and you can do that with 2 units because you have 2 chain guarders. So that's pretty useful for initiating an attack, because then you open your player phase with 2 enemies dead, or 1 enemy dead, 1 enemy damaged, 2 enemies damaged. And it's much easier to clean up a kill than it is to dive into a huge group and kill all of them. So just running him from his paralog onward, no XP farming, nothing. I still think he's A tier. He's just another chain guard or heal bot that adds utility to your team and is useful. Saphir, I think she's like the definition of B tier. She is like late game filler in case your team died, or if you just want some extra damage for free and you don't want to invest in a unit. She comes with decent SP. She has okay strength. Her accuracy is kind of so-so, and she'll need some kind of engraving to fix it, or some kind of thing to fix it. Otherwise, you're looking at like bad hit rates, especially when shooting at Falcon Knights. Sorry, Griffin Knights. They're very similar. When shooting at Griffin Knights, she has a hard time hitting them. When shooting at Wyverns, she has like a kind of like a bad time, but not as hard, because Wyverns are a little bit slower than Griffins. But if like she's a warrior, right? She has a bow. So if there's an enemy flying at you and she has a bow, you want to shoot that thing down, and it seems to be effective. But she can miss, and it can be unfortunate. So she wants some hit fixing, but outside of that, she's a decent unit. You can throw a longbow on her, a killer bow, a steel, or not a, I almost said silver bow, a steel bow, because she just has C rank, and she's okay. Linden, I think, is similar. I think he's just like mid-game filler. He's not like a hard carry. He's just kind of like decent. He just helps you out to some degree if you want to run an extra unit. It's basically like a leveled unit without the investment. So these are just kind of like good filler. Maybe they're better than these. It's hard to say. But yeah, they're not bad. And he also can use staves because he's a sage. So he's actually pretty solid. All right, and then next we have Vale. So this is not DLC, so I'm putting her S tier because some people think she's crazy on S, or crazy on DLC. I think she's like here. I think she's like low A tier. I almost want to put her in B, like high B tier. I think that's actually fair because she has like durability issues. She's not the most accurate. She's like middling accuracy. She's not like inaccurate. Oh, is Ivy in this? Just making sure. Sometimes these lists don't have everyone. Okay, good. I was about to say, like, I didn't see Ivy. Just like units missing. All right. Let's just make sure everyone's here. I did a tier list and there were units missing, and I'll never live it down. All right. All right, I think B tier is fine. She does come with 2.5k SP, which is a lot. But even though she joins the team with that much, by the time you get her, it's so far into the late game that all of the engravings are used up. Most of your resources are used up. It's really hard to justify. Like, most of your bond fragments are used up unless you're doing fishing. And that's with welling, because like the thing that happens when you use the well is you get tons of SP. Getting tons of SP generally means you're going to be burning through bond fragments to unlock passives. So by the time you get here, you're out of like everything. So to even justify like upgrading all of her stuff, it can be hard to do that just because you simply lack the resources. So if you had the resources, maybe, but you only get to use her for like 3 to 4 chapters anyways. And on one of them, you can't change any of her shit until after you deploy, because she's like a green unit, and then she becomes a blue unit once the match starts. So it's one of those. But that being said, she's okay. I mean, she's serviceable. She has decent damage. She has low speed. She generally can't double unless you fix her build with like speed plus whatever, speed taker, build plus. She has the dagger, which is kind of neat. It doesn't really do too much. It does contribute to adding true damage as a magical debuff tool, but it's basically about as good as Hellfire, which isn't even that good in endgame anyways. So she's okay. She's not like a hard carry in late game. Maybe with the right build, she's a low A tier, but you'd have to work to get her there. I feel like just running her and, giving her passives, trying to give her whatever engraving is left, because by this point, like, everything is used up, and that's really the issue. And it's so far in the late game. It's like getting one of those like legendary weapons in like chapter 24. It's like, cool, I get to use this for 2 chapters. It's very much like that. So it's like hard to invest in. Ivy, I'm not putting her in C tier. I'm just like hovering. Ivy, I think, is low A tier. Probably she's better than that. She's better than these. Yeah, I'd say she's like here, or mid A tier, sorry. She's definitely better than Anna because she doesn't require as much to get up and running. Essentially, all you have to do on her is just use her and she'll be fine, and then you can fix her speed if you want to go for doubling. But she has decent defensive stat. It's not really high. It's high enough that she can tank physical often, and if you fix her speed, she can actually be quite tanky, assuming she's not getting hit by like Excalibur or like a bow or something. So she can actually be quite durable. She has decent res and defense, so she's kind of bulky for a mage, which is nice. So she can enemy phase, depending on what's attacking her, of course. But she's actually pretty solid. Her only real issue is sometimes she hits like 70 to 80% hit rates, which those can miss pretty frequently. And comparing that to like Anna, who has much higher dex, she usually has no accuracy problems, but has more speed build problems. And she still has speed problems, but I think she has higher build on Lindworm. They both have speed problems, but she also has accuracy problems. But her bulk is better, and she requires less investment. So, and she flies, which is pretty nice. Okay, Fogado. Honestly, I think he's probably like here. Make him a warrior or use Radiant Bow, and he's pretty solid. I personally don't run him, but I see the bases, I see the stats, I understand how the game works. I think he's pretty solid. His passive is dumb. It doesn't really help you much, but you know, you could throw him on warrior, you could leave him on Cupido, on Radiant Bow, Cupido, or just warrior, and he can do well in both. There's probably other classes for him, like Halberdier or Hero. But yeah, he's a pretty solid unit. Timerra, I think, is similar. I think these two are very similar. You get her earlier, but they're both these like speedy-ish, like decent above average defense units that favor tanking over like nuking, and they want to be made into tanks, you know, with their passives, with their emblem ring selection or whatever. And I think she's a really good tank. I've consistently used her with varying degrees of investment. The only run where she was bad was my first Maddening run. It was just one of those issues where she just wasn't able to get kills because everything else was killing it. And that actually happened to Kagetsu in one of my runs, where like my other units were just killing everything, and then I just had an extra turn and there was nothing for him to kill, and then he just ended up underleveled. That's just what happened to her on my first Maddening run. But on every other Maddening run since then, I've done runs where I dumped a bunch of stat boosters into her and made her this like attacking unit. I've done runs where I've put no stat boosters into her and just left Ike on her, handed her a javelin, which is not even like some crazy, unique, hard to get weapon, and she did fine as a tank. Same thing with Goldmary. I feel like these are just solid mid-game tanks that can run different emblems for varying degrees of success, whereas these are more like nukes. So these are your tanks, these are your nukes. He can't tank as well as these, that's for sure. These tank much better than him, unless you're avoid tanking, in which case he might be better because he's fast. So, but yeah, very very solid unit. Some people think she's bad, but the trick to leveling her up is very simple. You just do paralogs. Maybe the first couple of chapters after you get her, she levels up slow because of her internal level. But if you just do like a few paralogs, like 1 to 2 paralogs, she will level up to 5 pretty quickly and then come online immediately for following chapters. And honestly, you should do paralogs as early as possible if you're going to do them anyways, because you get more XP and you power level. So that's like more of like a strategy thing in terms of like resource management. Let me zoom out here. There we go. I'm finding that it's like hard to see everything because we're too zoomed in. All right, so who else? We have Alfred. We have Alcryst. He's like kind of tucked away in there. We have Diamant. Just going to scan through this to make sure I'm not missing anyone. Some of these are just like random. Maybe Saline. Random NPCs. We have Mavier. Okay, so next we have Saline. Saline's an interesting unit. A lot of people put her in A or B tier. I don't really see too many people putting her in S tier. She has like low build and low base speed. Her speed growth isn't bad, but she has low base speed, and that kind of hurts her long term because then she kind of has to catch up if she wants to double, and her low build puts her in the same like problem as Anna. But I would argue Anna is a better unit overall when invested in, but Saline is good early game if you promote her because then you have another staff user. So there's an argument to be made. I'm aware of her Levin Sword build. Levin Sword with Sigurd is a use case some people like to do, like early game. They like to throw Sigurd and a Levin Sword on her early and, you know, go for big overrides and stuff like this. I would say she's like low A tier. I think that's fair. I think she's better than Veil because she has enough bulk and speed to not get doubled and one-rounded by most things early to mid-game. Late game, she might get hit like one-shot by things. I think that's fair. But she can always just become like a Corrin spammer and still be relevant, and then use Thoron to freeze enemies at a safe distance, so she can still be useful on your team. So she still is like a staff unit who can attack with Levin Sword, who can use Thoron to clean up damage, to set up kills, to freeze things with Corrin. She can spam fire on Corrin. So she's pretty much always relevant. Every time I run her, I never feel like she's bad. She's not like a hard carry that's going to one-round things frequently, but she has a little bit of everything. She's kind of like a generalist. She has a little bit of damage, a little bit of utility. Even her like personal class can't make up its mind as to what it wants to be. It's like tome, swords, staves. It's like, what are you? Everything. So she's kind of like a generalist. If you view her through only the lens of damage, she's not an A tier damage unit. But if you view her through like a generalist lens, where it's like, okay, she kind of brings a little bit of everything, then I would say she averages out to an A tier. She's certainly not an S tier, but she's like somewhere in between B and A. So like a low A, a high B. Diamant, he seems decent. I'll put him in high B tier. My problem with him is that I think there are better units to invest in early game, and mid game hands you crazy units that are much better than him. So I would rather invest in these early, and I'd rather run these late or these late, because I feel like all of these, excluding Hortensia as damage units, are much better than him. Now, he does have some enemy phase potential because of his unique skill, but the proc rate on it is kind of low. So it's very situational. It's very luck-based in a way. There are ways to mitigate it by running holdout so that you can, guarantee you survive or whatever, in case his passive doesn't trigger and you're trying to get a heal off of it. In terms of bases, let's pull them up really quick just so I have them. All right, Diamant. 13 strength is decent. 13 speed isn't that good, though, if we're being honest. And then his build of 9. So he has some build to him, and I'm pretty sure he has build growth as well. He has 15 build growth, 40 speed, which isn't bad. I'm pretty sure his one class has bad dex cap, which kind of hurts it because it needs high dex. But you can't exceed dex cap with passives that increase dex or emblem rings that increase dex, because his passive is dex based. But I think there's better enemy phasers, and I think there's better... I think he's kind of like a generalist enemy phaser with some bulk. Like this, I mean, that's basically an enemy phaser. He's basically an enemy phaser, but I think there's better enemy phasers. I think these just outclass him. They have better bases, speed. I mean, you get them later, but they have better... You don't get them that much later, though. You get him at the end of Chapter 8, and then you get her, Chapter 16, so that is late, but her Chapter 13, so it's not that much later. And I don't even think you really need enemy phase tanks until later on if you're not warp skipping. If you're warp skipping, you don't have to run these. So you still can, though, if you want. All right, then we have Mavier. All right, Mavier. I feel like he's like high B tier. I think he's decent. He's not terrible. He's not like the best thing ever. He's not going to help you beat the game necessarily, but he's a staff user that can deal some chip damage with average, sometimes above average hit rates. He can deal chip damage with Flame Lance. He comes with a Flame Lance. He also joins with, I think it's either a Silver or Steel Great Lance, but he has terrible hit rates on that, so just hand him something that's more accurate, maybe something with an accuracy engraving if you want him to be a chip damage unit. Otherwise, you can just load him with staves and just have him pump out like physics and heals and obstructs or freezes or whatever, silences. Just throw like an obstruct, a silence, a freeze, a physic, and a heal staff on him and call it a day. Like you can just make him a mounted staff bot and he'll contribute. But that late into the game, if your team is good, he is just an extra unit. If you don't have another unit to run. If your team is bad, he can kind of help you, but he's definitely not going to carry in any way. It's too late for him. Like, you get him way too late for him to be made into a hard carry. At best, he would be like an A tier unit with investment, but, just running him in general, giving him weapons, running passives on him, I don't think he's going to get much higher than a B. At best, like a low A tier. Alfred... think he's bad. I think he's very bad. He has terrible bases. His growths aren't bad. 40% strength growth, 40% speed, 40% defense, 10% build, 65% health. His growths aren't bad. It's just that his bases are so low that he feels terrible to invest in, especially early game. He doesn't double anything. So like, what are his bases? So he starts out level 5. He has 9 strength, 10 dex, and 6 speed. So he's very slow. Chloe has 13 speed. So just consider this. He has 6 speed. Chloe has 13 speed. She also has 13 dex. So she starts off way more accurate than he is. She doubles way more consistently. She does have lower strength, though, by 1 point. But she snowballs fast. So, like, because she can double, she can one-round things by herself, which means she can snowball herself. Whereas he can't do that, and he has kind of bad accuracy. He misses a lot. I think he is better than these, though. I'd say he's better than these. He does miss a lot. He has like 70 to 80% hit rates on like Steel Lance, and it just feels bad to use. And you could theoretically invest in him, but I don't think it scales as well as like a Chloe would. Ultimately, his passive isn't that useful either. Her passive is true damage. So her passive is actually a little weird. You actually have to have a male and a female standing next to each other and within 2 range for her passive to trigger. Not just a general male and female within 2 range. So if you're wondering why it doesn't work sometimes, that's the reason. However, it's true damage, and if you quad or double, it's +4 to +8 damage. So way better than Self-Improver. So sorry, buddy. Okay. Alcryst. Alcryst, I think, is like low A tier. So Alcryst requires almost nothing to invest in terms of getting him up and running. He does everything Etier does early game, but he just has more bulk. Middle game, you can keep him on his main class and go for Luna procs. His damage can kind of fall off, and there's ways to fix it. You could also switch his classes too, but it's up to you. I mean, it depends on... Actually, I'm not even sure if he's A tier. I know some people swear by him, because I like thinking about how I play now. I think the highest I'd put him is like here, like high B tier, because he's a player phase archer. So it's like he can't enemy phase, so he's not flexible. He can take a hit, but he can't enemy phase. He has a good passive that does help him with his damage, and it's easy to set up. But the thing with archers is, I feel like the designers of the game want you to have archers on your team to specifically shoot down flyers, but if you build your like damage units correctly, they can just one-round enemy flyers regardless of weapon type. So I feel like the intention of archers being better than they are is there and literally designed into the game, but the reality of how the game is played contradicts that. So instead of having, these crazy useful archers that shoot down flyers in one hit and it being a big deal, you have archers can do this thing, but they can't kill other enemies very well, generally, and they don't have very many options to deal with other enemies. So if I'm a sword unit, I have options. I have Armor Slayer, I have Levin Sword, I have Killer Weapon, Killing Edge, whatever. I have just like general beater swords, like swords you can just whack enemies with, like a silver, a steel, the hero's weapon. So like you have your general nuke weapons, you have your Armor Slayers. Like the Armor Slayer is actually really good at killing armor, so unsurprisingly. Like an Armor Slayer +3 on a unit with decent strength can just melt armor like it was a mage. So like being like a sword lance wyvern is really nice because you can get your main killer weapon, like your main weapon that just doubles in one rounds most things, whether it be, a lance or sword, and then you can run an Armor Slayer, and then you can run a Rider's Bane, and it's like that feels pretty good. And you can also run a Javelin and or a Levin Sword. So you have flexibility to target physical, like target defense or res, you have flexibility to hit armor weakness, you have flexibility to hit rider weakness, you have flexibility to javelin on enemy phase if like archers attack you, and you're like doing like a bondage shield or something, or to enemy phase mages. Like if you're on Griffin or Wyvern, you can enemy phase on javelin mages, because mages aren't a threat unless they have like Elwind or Excalibur, and you can just double them on counterattack and kill them, and it's no big deal. So it's pretty useful to have flexibility. And for that reason, Wyvern is pretty solid. Probably one of the best classes. There are other classes that are just as good, though. Like, I don't think Wyvern's really necessarily always better than Warrior, for example, or even like Hero. I think they all have their pros and cons. Flyer weakness is a massive con, and you do have to play around it. I'm used to it, but if you're not, it can be annoying, so I totally get it. Let's just make sure we didn't miss anyone. We have the DLC. I can kind of do the DLC units. I've used them a little bit, so I have like a general idea. So for fun, all right, so we have you, we have these. These aren't even the DLC ones, though. These are like the these are like the actual enemy bosses. So this is not like updated. So I'll save that for the next one. Because I still need to get more experience with them, so I'd kind of be like ballparking it. But honestly, let's do it anyways. Let's do these 3. So as a playable unit, I think she seems to be like the same tier. She's like Ivy. She's so similar to Ivy, it's ridiculous. She's basically like an Ivy clone. Instead of having staff access, she has sword access. But she has similar bulk, similar level. Depends on how you unlock her. Like if you do the Xenolog early, you have a level 20 unit early game, which is really stupid and breaks the game. If you do it mid-game, you have a level 20 unit that breaks the game. If you do it late mid-game, then you're fine, then it's balanced. But if you do it at any point before late mid-game, which is like chapter 16 and onward, she's just over-leveled and will be just really stupid, like really strong. But she's pretty solid. She seems to be like here, maybe here. She's like a tank. She has decent stats. Madeline, she's okay. He seems to be kind of similar, just kind of like a generic sage. Maybe they're like low A tier though, because they're level depending on when you unlock them. So like A tier. I think most of the DLC units are like A tier. Maybe Nell is S tier because for 0 investment you have basically a somewhat fed Timerra in some ways. So there's something to be said about that. She has really good stats. She's kind of like one of these. She's kind of like a Kagetsu. She's just like naturally good. And then the other dude, Rafal, he's very similar to Panette. And Nell is kind of very similar to Kagetsu. So they're probably both S tier and the other ones are just an A. So yeah, that's it for my tier list. Some things moved up, some things moved down, some things shifted. If you agree or disagree, let me know. Definitely like and subscribe if you enjoy these tier lists. This is the 3rd one. This is at like, I'm definitely over 600 hours. I might be at 700. I might be at like 680 or something like that, but I'm approaching 700 hours, which is probably not ideal. Like it's probably playing this game too much, but all right. Thanks for checking this out. Peace.